Welcome back to the Stanley Parable. Today we're going to talk about proxies. No, not VPN stuff. We're talking about proxy characters, characters that speak on behalf of someone else. This is a very flexible and common technique that will help your emotional beats connect. This game is like 99% proxies, so if you want to know how to use proxies, you should just play this game while paying attention to how they use proxies, and you'll probably figure it out. In fact, that's exactly what you should do. Go do that and then come back and we'll compare notes, because I'm going to spoil it. Alright, let's get started. If you are making a narrative, at some point you are going to want to connect with the player. You're going to want them to feel something. Whether that's the bittersweet longing of understanding that human life has a limit and all things are ephemeral, or whether you just want them to be really upset that a big werewolf ate their daughter. Big or small, deep or shallow, those emotions are important, and you put them in the game. You craft your cutscenes, you polish them up, and you like them. But when you call in the other players, the test players, that doesn't go so well. They think your ruminations on the nature of life are boring and trite, and they think the moment where that werewolf eats your daughter is the funniest moment in the game. Oh no. That didn't work. We did not meet expectation. Oh, what a travesty. How did we screw it up? What can we do to fix it? Oh my gosh. In that moment, there can be an impulse to pull back. Maybe they're reacting because you went too far. But that's really not the problem, is it? Here's the thing you have to understand about cutscenes. You will always fail. That's not a commentary on your skill level. It's just the way that cutscenes work. Even if you did manage to make a cutscene that would make everyone on the planet weep if they watched it, someone is trying to feed their screaming toddler while they're watching your cutscene. It's not going to make them weep. You will always fail. So, a lot of your approach has to take that into account. Part of making a narrative is understanding that that narrative is not always going to connect every single time. This is something indie games screw up a lot. Most indie games will have the message of their game be the objective truth of the indie game. For example, there is a relatively popular Games Grump episode where they take an old lady into a graveyard, they sit her down on a bench, a sad song plays, and then she dies. Now, it's pretty funny as an episode goes, but there are very few people that is going to connect to. The game itself is saying that the objective reality of the game's universe is this message. Now, that's going to connect with more people, depending on the sort of setup you've got, whether you're in an indie game convention about that sort of thing or whatever. But for the most part, that's going to have a pretty low hit rate. A lot of people are going to think that that is a smug and over try hard way of presenting your message. It's going to be bad. It's not going to work out. Is there an alternative? Yeah, you're looking at it. One alternative of many is to use a proxy character. A proxy character takes responsibility for the emotional content of whatever they're saying, and connect or fail to connect, the emotions are connecting to them, not to the game as a whole. In this case, the narrator is a proxy character. That's not always true. Not all narrators are proxy characters, but this narrator is. And therefore, his ruminations on the nature of life and the nature of work are his. Sure, it's pretty clear the game devs share the same sort of opinions, but they don't make it a megaphone situation. Anything that the narrator does is clearly something the narrator is doing, and all of the emotional fallout, positive and negative, gets attached to the narrator specifically. In fact, they go out of their way to make the narrator miss. The narrator misses more than half the time on purpose because it's a comedy game, and they want you to think the narrator is a pompous ass. But that's the secret, isn't it? You can miss with as many cutscenes as you want if there's always another narrative beat that says the same thing coming up right after. The narrator might go into his ruminations on the nature of life and work 100 times, and he might miss 99 times. And as long as those 99 misses are character development and are fun, his one hit will be enough. So the secret to how you make an emotional connection to the player, one very powerful approach is to just have a character try and make that emotional connection, and have them try and make that emotional connection as many times as you feel is required. Now, as a demonstration, I'm going to show you one of the endings of this game, what you could call the true ending, or the common ending. In this part of the game, the narrator will narrate for quite a while. Pay attention to how the game supports his narration and supports the emotions that he's trying to call into existence, but the reality of the game is clearly not the same as the reality of the narrator. The narrator is clearly narrating things that are personal to him, his own judgments, his own insights, and while the game is supporting him and trying to allow him to receive that kind of emotional connection, it's very clearly not like the thing the game is saying. It's very clearly the thing the narrator is saying. Ready? Let's give it a peek.
Blackness and a rising chill of uncertainty. Was it over? Yes! He had won! He had defeated the machine, unshackled himself from someone else's command. Freedom was mere moments away. And yet, even as the immense door slowly opened, Stanley reflected on how many puzzles still lay unsolved. Where had his co-workers gone? How had he been freed from the machine's grasp? What other mysteries did this strange building hold? But as sunlight streamed into the chamber, he realized none of this mattered to him, for it was not knowledge or even power that he had been seeking, but happiness. Perhaps his goal had not been to understand, but to let go. No longer would anyone tell him where to go, what to do, or how to feel. Whatever life he lives, it will be his. And that was all he needed to know. It was perhaps the only thing worth knowing. Stanley stepped through the open door. Stanley felt the cool breeze upon his skin, the feeling of liberation, the immense possibility of the new path before him. This was exactly the way, right now, that things were meant to happen. And Stanley was happy.
Now, how much that connected with you probably varies from person to person. Some people probably felt that was pretty sweet. Some people probably felt it was extremely goofy. Some people probably felt it was both. But all of the emotional core of that was in the narrator's hands. If you felt that the narrator's message hit, then that's fine. You feel that the narrator is very insightful. And if you feel that he misses, that's fine too. You feel that the narrator is kind of a goofball. By allowing the emotional truth to be assigned to a character, you can be okay with it missing. This happens a lot, to the point where it's hard to draw a line between proxy characters and just characters that are serving their role in the narrative, because in many cases, the whole point of a proxy character is that they are indistinguishable from a character that is just doing their job, just being a character. The narrator clearly shares a lot of the same beliefs as the game devs, but because they are created in such a way where those beliefs are clearly their own beliefs, it never feels like it's the game devs trying to preach at you. And we can sort of keep going with that into other sorts of IPs. For example, Dragon Ball. Vegeta and Goku are fighting, and Vegeta punches Goku so hard that Goku goes flying back and hits a mountain, and there's a giant plume of sand. And everybody is is aghast. They zoom in on Krillin, and Krillin just looks shocked. And they zoom in on Bulma, and Bulma just looks shocked. And they zoom in on Tien, and Tien just looks shocked. And they do that like 8 times. Those characters are obviously acting in character, but they are also being a proxy. They are explaining to you the emotion you should be having, the emotion that the writer wants you to have in that particular scene. The writer wants you to be shocked, so here are some shocked characters. This is super common, and it works equally well in very serious situations. Aerith dies. Spoilers. And what do? They show Sephiroth not caring, and then they show Cloud hands out reach, trying desperately to grab her. Oh, she slipped through his fingers. Oh. Cloud and Sephiroth are playing the role of emotional proxies. The close-ups on them are to tell you what you should think about the scene and those characters. Even if you don't buy into the Aerith death scene, you'll still buy that Cloud was devastated by it. So when the game moves forward and Cloud is devastated by it, you can accept that, and you can buy into that, and you can feel closer to Cloud as he starts to try and work through that grief. The emotions of the scene don't necessarily have to hit the audience. If they do, great. But if they don't, you can still understand those emotions have hit somebody in the game world. They've hit Cloud in that case. This is obviously a technique that is easy to use in virtually any environment, to the point where a lot of writers use it without even considering it to be, proxies. They don't think of it as a proxy. They just think of it as, yeah, this is the character that's doing that stuff. But it's an extension of proxies. It's part of the superset of proxy-related stuff. It's a character that is designed from the ground up to be a proxy for the needs of that particular kind of situation. This can go in a lot of different ways. It can do a lot of different things, but it's also something that doesn't have to be done strictly by the devs. It doesn't have to be done strictly by the writer. I mean, obviously, the writer is involved because they're writing it. But you don't have to have proxy characters that are a mouthpiece for the writer. You can switch proxies around so that proxies can be proxies for other characters. This technique is used quite frequently in the 2022 stuff. Here is a quick little example. Let's turn the audio back on.
Now this, Stanley thought to himself, this is a bucket. And indeed it was.
Now, the bucket is obviously not a character in any meaningful sense, but it's a character to the narrator. And what this does is it allows the narrator to treat Stanley as a proxy character. Stanley is now the narrator's proxy character, and the bucket plays the role that Stanley used to. This allows the narrator to shift everything around, and it allows the narrator to be a lot more truthful, because now the narrator can say that Stanley does and says whatever the narrator wants to do and say. This shifting, because we've introduced a proxy for a character in the game world to use, allows for a whole new vista of meaningful emotional beats.
Stanley clutched the bucket tightly to his chest and entered the door on his left.
Now, while this isn't 100% obvious all the time, it is pretty clear that a lot of the time in this particular scenario, the narrator is using Stanley as a proxy for the narrator, and the bucket as a proxy for Stanley.
Still no one was here. Stanley needed the bucket's warmth and comfort now more than ever. Perhaps his boss's office was where he'd find. Coming to a staircase, Stanley and the bucket walked upstairs to the boss's office. Stepping into his manager's office, Stanley was once again stunned to discover not an indication of any human life. But Stanley guessed the correct code by sheer luck. Was it that the bucket knew all along? Was the bucket guiding him? Yes, this is certainly the most logical explanation.
Let's get the 3 ending.
Wait, Stanley said to the bucket. Can we go back up? When I was pressing those keypad buttons, there was something very intriguing about the number 3. I want to go back so I can try pressing the number 3 again. The bucket said nothing.
Now, if you've never played this game before, you might not really be able to understand how close Stanley's dialogue here is to what the narrator does in this game.
Here we are, said Stanley. Now I'm going to try out that number 3 button. He took the bucket over to the keypad and began absolutely slamming on the number 3 over and over and over. Wow, he said. The number 3 is such a special button. I'm having the time of my life. Stanley looked expectantly at the bucket, but the bucket remained silent. This was a shock to Stanley, who had always felt such a connection with the bucket. How was this not as exciting to the bucket as it was to him? Once Stanley had had enough of the number 3, he got back in the elevator. Perhaps the bucket had missed something. Perhaps it had not seen how much joy Stanley got from slamming the number 3 repeatedly. No, said Stanley to the bucket. You can't go on yet. Not till you understand how much the number 3 means to me. You and I have been through so much together, and I just want you to see what I see. Feel the happiness I feel. He smiled at the bucket, and the bucket said nothing.
Now keep in mind that even though now Stanley is being the proxy for the narrator and the bucket is for the proxy for Stanley, the narrator is the proxy for the game devs, and Stanley is the proxy for their attempts to communicate with the player. It's all proxies, all the way down.
Here we go, said Stanley. This time I'll really show you. He ran to the number 3 and began to wail on it like a musician on a beloved instrument, weaving a concerto of truth and passion. He wielded the number 3 like a fine artist would wield a paintbrush. He told stories through the number 3, stories of his dreams and hopes and fears. And the whole time, he looked to his bucket for a reaction of some kind. Anything to let him know that the bucket appreciated what he was doing. The bucket conveyed absolutely nothing at all, only silence. Crushed by a wave of dejection, Stanley returned to the elevator. Stanley and the bucket were so close. They'd always been there for one another. Why suddenly could the bucket not connect with this passion of Stanley's? The question caused Stanley to ruminate the whole way down the elevator. He knew that there must be a way to get through to the bucket, to communicate fully with his dear friend. Surely there was a solution, mustn't there be? Said Stanley. I know what to do. I know how to fully express this feeling in my heart. He decided right then and there that he would hold a press conference where he would speak to the public on all matters relating to pressing the number 3 over and over. He would elaborate fully on what the number 3 meant to him and why he felt so alive when pressing it. Then the bucket would be able to see his joy through the eyes of others. It would get to see the world react to this discovery of Stanley's. And it would be through the public eye that the bucket would finally understand Stanley's work.
Of course, press conferences are a proxy for indie games. If it sounds like I'm reading into this, I'm not. It's pretty clear.
Building excitement around it, developing and rehearsing it until it couldn't be refined a single measure further. When the big day arrived, Stanley was as prepared as he'd ever been for anything in his life. This was it. One last chance to win the bucket over. One opportunity to share a true connection with a loved one. There was no one here. Nobody had come to the press conference to hear Stanley speak, to listen to him talk about what it really means to press the number 3 on a keypad over and over. He was unloved, uninteresting, he was a failure, and in that moment Stanley knew that the bucket would never again take him seriously. There would be no connection, no deeper understanding. The bucket merely sat there in his arms, indifferent. And so it began that slowly, over many years, the two of them grew more and more distant. They spoke less and less, neither wishing to state the obvious, that any sense of real respect between them had eroded since that day at the press conference. There would be no more games, no more long conversations about passion and pursuit, only a silence that consumed the space between friends. And Stanley, having for once in his life discovered the warmth and comfort of true companionship, was cast back into the unremarkable normalcy of loneliness.
So obviously that's a lot of proxies, and I just wanted to let you see that this is something that can be used in 100 different ways. By allowing a character to read into another character or to speak through another character, you can establish the role of both of those characters, and you can give them both responsibility for emotional beats. Now, you might take offense to my particular interpretation of the meaning of the bucket and so on. That's fine. But the point here is you can switch things around. You can use proxies not just to talk about what the game dev wants to talk about, or not just to establish the emotional truth of a scene, but also within the game, within the narrative, you can create new proxies that will allow other characters to speak more truthfully within the game world because they can do it through a proxy. A classic example of that would be, for example, a parent and a child, and the parent insists that they know what the child is thinking and what the child is scared of, and so on and so forth. And in the process, the parent reveals a lot more about themselves. This is far from the only set of ways to use proxies. For example, there is an ending in this game, several endings in this game, where there is another narrator, and that narrator narrates about the first narrator. And of course, that is another way to use it. That's a way of creating a layer of space. And we'll talk about that in another episode. There are some more advanced techniques you can use for creating distance layers. But for that, we are going to want to talk about the epilogue, and that would take another half hour, so we're going to leave that out. The point I'm trying to make, pretty simply, if you are trying to make an emotional connection to the character, having someone with a face, or someone with an emotional presence, do that is generally better than trying to make the objective reality of the game do that. For the very least, if you miss, then you don't want the objective reality of the game to be wrong. It's okay if a character is wrong. That's just character building. But the objective reality of the game is something that should be not completely wrong all the time. Anyway, I hope this was clear. Let me know what your thoughts are down below.